I'm a 43-year-old man married for 15 years with two kids ages 12 and 10. For most of my marriage, things were pretty smooth. My wife has always been very close to her family. Her parents and sister live just a few miles away, which means we've always had regular gatherings and drop-ins. For years, it was manageable. I'd chalk it up to family being close-knit, which is important to my wife. But lately, things have taken a turn that's left me feeling like our home has become a revolving door. The change started small, but it escalated fast. My sister-in-law, who lives about 10 minutes away, began stopping by more frequently, and it wasn't just for a cup of coffee. She started bringing her kids along every weekend. At first, it seemed harmless, just cousins playing together, right? But then, her visits started to stretch into entire afternoons, then full days. Before I knew it, every Saturday and Sunday, our living room was filled with kids running around, toys everywhere, and a constant noise level that never seemed to drop. My wife would chat with her sister while I tried to keep the kids entertained. It was like our home had turned into a free daycare. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was a phase. But soon enough, it wasn't just the weekends. My mother-in-law got into the habit of dropping by unannounced during the week, sometimes just to chat, other times to help with the kids. And that's when the comments started. She had a lot of opinions on how we were raising our kids, like how strict I was about their screen time or what I allowed them to eat. I'm not a control freak or anything, but I have rules, like no phones at the dinner table and a limit on video games during school nights. She made it clear she thought I was being too harsh, dropping comments like, when my kids were their age, we didn't worry about these things. My wife just brushed it off, saying it was just her mom being her mom. She means well, she'd say. But it didn't stop there. The more my mother-in-law came over, the more she'd try to weigh in. It wasn't just about the kids, she'd comment on everything. From what we had for dinner to how clean the house was. She'd even start reorganizing our pantry, saying, this would make more sense over here. It was intrusive, but my wife didn't see it that way. One evening, after another long Saturday with my sister-in-law's kids running through the house and my mother-in-law dropping in to check on things, I decided to bring it up. I told my wife that I thought we needed to set some boundaries. We'd been through a lot together, but this was starting to feel like too much. Our home was supposed to be a place where we could relax, not a community center. I explained how the constant noise and interruptions were making it hard for me to focus on my work. I've been working from home lately, and it's not easy to jump on a conference call with kids screaming in the background. But she didn't see it that way. She thought I was overreacting, that I didn't understand how important her family was to her. She said she didn't want to hurt their feelings by setting boundaries, that it would make things awkward. I could see that this conversation wasn't going anywhere, so I let it drop, hoping things would improve on their own. They didn't. A few weeks later, I hit a breaking point. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was on a video call with my boss. Right in the middle of the call, my sister-in-law showed up with her kids, completely unannounced. The kids were playing loudly in the background, and I had to apologize to my boss for the noise. When I finally managed to wrap up the call, I went downstairs and told my sister-in-law that she couldn't keep dropping by without notice, especially during work hours. She seemed surprised but shrugged it off, saying she thought we wouldn't mind since the kids get along so well. That night, I sat my wife down again. This time I told her I couldn't deal with this anymore. I laid out some simple rules: no visits without calling ahead first, and no more unplanned babysitting. If her sister wanted to bring the kids over, she needed to ask us in advance. It wasn't an unreasonable request, but my wife acted like I was asking her to cut ties with her family completely. She agreed, but I could tell she wasn't happy about it. It didn't take long for things to blow up. The following weekend, my sister-in-law showed up again without any warning, kids in tow. I met her at the door and told her, as calmly as I could, that she needed to call before coming over. She didn't take it well. She left in a huff. And that's when the real trouble started. My mother-in-law called me later that evening, saying she heard I had turned her daughter away and asked why I was trying to come between family. I tried to explain, but she didn't want to hear it. According to her, I was being controlling and trying to isolate my wife from them. The tension spilled over into the house. My kids overheard the conversations and started asking me why they couldn't see their cousins like before. My wife, caught in the middle, was frustrated and distant, saying I'd made everything harder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being painted as the bad guy, even though I thought I was just trying to make things work for our own family. But with every unannounced visit I turned away, the resentment seemed to grow, and I found myself wondering if I was making a mistake. Update 1. After I set the rules about visits, things quickly got more tense at home. My wife seemed caught between two worlds, her family and me. The air between us got colder, and arguments over the boundaries became a regular thing. She'd tell me that her family didn't mean any harm, that it was just how they were. But every time we argued, it felt like I was the only one who saw how the constant visits and comments were driving us apart. Then came the family barbecue, a monthly tradition at my in-laws' house. I knew it was going to be uncomfortable, but I figured I'd try to keep the peace. It didn't take long for my mother-in-law to pull me aside. She told me flat out that I was ruining the family dynamic. Her voice was low, but her words hit hard. According to her, I was turning into someone controlling, making my wife choose between me and her family. She brought up how back in the day family was always welcome in their home, no questions asked. I tried to explain my side, but it was like talking to a wall. She just kept insisting that I was making my wife miserable and that I needed to let things go. I didn't know what else to say, so I walked away. But that conversation stuck with me. And the worst part, I wasn't the only one she talked to. A few days later, my kids started asking questions. They wanted to know why they couldn't see their cousins like they used to, why I was being so strict. They even said that I was making their mom sad. It was clear they had heard the grown-ups talking. I tried to tell them that it wasn't about not seeing their cousins but about having some space, but it didn't seem to make a difference. They looked at me like I was the bad guy, and every time they mentioned their cousins, it felt like I was losing them a little bit more. Around this time, my sister-in-law decided to join in. During one of the rare family gatherings I attended, she made sure to mention how her husband doesn't mind at all when the family drops by any time. She made it sound so casual, but the message was clear. She thought I was being too rigid. My wife didn't defend me, she just looked down at her plate. It was another reminder that I was alone in this. Things at home got even worse after that. One night, after a particularly bad argument about the whole situation, my wife ended up sleeping on the couch. She said she needed space, that I was turning our house into a battleground. I tried to apologize for how things had gotten so bad, but she shut me down. She made it clear that she thought I was the one causing the divide. Still, I didn't change my stance. I held firm, reminding her that we needed a home that felt like our own, not just an extension of her parents' house. I suggested that maybe we should try couples therapy to work through things, but she shot the idea down, saying that we didn't need a stranger telling us how to fix our family. As the days went by, the distance between me and my kids only grew. They stopped telling me about their days at school or about the new friends they were making. I'd ask how things were, and they'd just shrug or give one-word answers. I could tell they saw me as the problem, the reason they couldn't have their cousins over every weekend. It hurt, but I didn't know how to bridge that gap. The real sting came when I tried to take my son on a fishing trip, a tradition we'd had since he was little. He looked at me and said he'd rather go to his cousin's house. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and watched him head out the door. I spent that Saturday sitting by the lake alone, replaying everything in my head. One night, I overheard my mother-in-law talking to my kids during a visit. She was telling them how dad just doesn't like us as much. My daughter looked confused, asking why I wouldn't let them see their family like before. I couldn't take it anymore. After they left, I confronted my wife about what her mom had said. She brushed it off, saying it was just venting, and that her mom didn't mean any harm. But I could see how those words were affecting our kids. Eventually, I managed to get a small win. After yet another argument, my wife reluctantly agreed that we could try a compromise. Visits could happen, but with notice and a limit on how often. It wasn't exactly what I wanted, but it was something. The first time my sister-in-law called before coming over, I felt like maybe things could actually work. But it didn't last. Not long after, my sister-in-law made a snide comment about how I'd finally got my way. She made it clear she thought I was the reason her visits were being restricted, and it didn't sit well. She said that my wife was different now, not as close to the family, and that it was all because of me. When I mentioned the limits, she just rolled her eyes and said I was turning my wife against her own family. It felt like I was right back where I started. That night, I posted on Reddit. I wanted to know if I was in the wrong, if I was being too rigid, or if I had the right to set these boundaries. The comments poured in, some saying I was too controlling, others insisting I was being manipulated by my wife's family. But even with all that advice, I still didn't know what the right answer was. All I knew was that things at home were falling apart, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. Update 2. After the arguments reached a boiling point, I convinced my wife to try couples counseling. She wasn't thrilled about it, but she agreed. I thought maybe a neutral third party could help us find some common ground. But every session turned into a debate about why I wouldn't just let things go. My wife kept bringing up how important her family was to her, and the therapist suggested that maybe she should try talking to them about setting boundaries. My wife just shook her head, saying that it wasn't an option, that it would never work. The sessions got more tense as the weeks went on. It always came back to the same issue, my refusal to bend and let her family continue as they had been. One day, after a particularly rough session, she blew up at me in the parking lot. She accused me of ruining her happiness, of tearing her away from her family. She said that she was done letting me dictate the rules, and that things needed to change now. That night, she gave me an ultimatum. Either I backed down and allowed her family to visit whenever they wanted, or she was taking the kids and leaving for a while. I could see she meant it, but I knew what backing down would mean, a return to the chaos that had driven me to set those boundaries in the first place. So I stood my ground, telling her that I couldn't go back to how things were before. The next day, she started packing a bag. I watched as she gathered up clothes for herself and the kids, barely saying a word. The kids looked confused, asking if this meant they were going on a trip. My wife just told them they were going to stay with their aunt for a while. I tried to explain that it was just temporary, but they wouldn't even look at me. And just like that, they were gone. The silence that followed was something I wasn't prepared for. The house that had once felt too busy and noisy now felt hollow. I'd find myself standing in the empty rooms, expecting to hear my kids laughing or the hum of my wife chatting in the kitchen, but there was nothing. I tried to keep things as normal as possible. I'd call the kids every night, but they barely spoke to me. They would mumble a few words, then ask if they could go back to their video games or TV. They seemed more angry than sad, and I started hearing things that made me realize what was happening on the other side. My son asked me why I kicked mom out, saying that's what grandma had told him. It didn't take much to figure out that my in-laws were twisting the story. Around this time, I saw a post from my wife on social media. It wasn't direct, but it was clear enough to anyone who knew us. She wrote about how sometimes you have to choose family over control, and her friends flooded the comments with support, saying she was brave for doing what was right for her kids. I didn't engage, but it felt like the entire world was siding against me. As the days went on, I found myself struggling with the financial side of things too. With my wife and kids gone, the household expenses were suddenly all on me, and it hit hard. I started worrying about what would happen if this turned into something more permanent, especially with my in-laws in her ear. The thought of lawyers and custody battles kept me up at night. One evening, my daughter finally broke through the silence. She called me, her voice small and shaky, asking why I couldn't just let mom's family visit so they could come home. She didn't understand why things had to be this way. I tried to explain that it wasn't about not wanting them around, but about needing some space in our lives. She just cried and said she missed her room, her toys, her friends at school. It tore me up, hearing her like that. After that call, I started questioning everything. I'd sit alone in the dark, replaying every decision, every argument. I wondered if I should just give in, let her family have their way so I could have my family back. But then I'd think about what it would mean, going back to the endless drop-ins, the constant noise, the feeling that my home wasn't mine anymore. It felt like no matter what I chose, I was losing something important. My friends offered their advice, telling me I should just apologize and try to smooth things over, that it wasn't worth losing my family over some rules. They said I was being stubborn, that sometimes it's easier to just keep the peace. But even with their well-meaning suggestions, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was right to stand my ground, even if it meant being alone right now. Bills piled up, and the weight of everything started to press down harder. I wasn't sleeping much, and when I did, I'd wake up thinking I heard the kids in the hallway or my wife moving around downstairs, but it was just the empty house settling. The reality of being on my own was starting to hit me, and it wasn't the relief I thought it might be. It just felt empty. I knew my wife was talking about our situation with her family because I'd hear bits and pieces from mutual friends, hints that she was considering making this separation more permanent. It scared me, especially when I thought about how easily the narrative could turn against me in a legal setting. It felt like the walls were closing in, like everything I'd tried to build was crumbling down around me. In the end, I sat down to write another post, looking for advice or maybe just some sense that I wasn't completely alone in this. I needed to hear from others. Was I doing the right thing, or was I just being stubborn? Because at that moment, with everything slipping away, I honestly didn't know. Update 3. After weeks of silence and tension, I finally gave in. I called my wife, saying I was willing to compromise on the visiting rules if it meant she'd come home with the kids. It wasn't easy to swallow my pride like that, but the thought of losing my family for good was too much. To my relief, she agreed. A few days later, she came back with the kids, and for a brief moment, it felt like things might actually work out. For the first few days, the house was peaceful. The kids were back in their rooms, their laughter filling the halls again, and my wife seemed more relaxed. We even had a few family dinners that felt almost normal. I thought maybe we'd found some middle ground and that this nightmare might finally be over. But that calm didn't last long. It started with my sister-in-law. As soon as she heard my wife was back home, she came over, claiming she needed a place to do some work for her side business. I didn't think much of it at first. She sat up in the dining room with her laptop and some papers. But her visits started stretching into full days, and soon she was using our house almost daily, turning our dining room into her personal office. I tried to bring it up with my wife, but she brushed it off, saying it wasn't a big deal, and that at least we were all back under one roof. But it didn't stop there. Pretty soon, the unannounced visits from the rest of her family picked up again. One afternoon, I came downstairs from a work call to find my in-laws in the living room, chatting away like they'd never left. When I reminded my wife about our agreement, that visits needed to be planned in advance, she just waved me off. "We're together now. Isn't that what matters?" she asked. And I could see this conversation was going nowhere. The kids were thrilled to have their cousins back around, and they made no secret of their preference. When I asked for a little quiet time in the afternoons, my son rolled his eyes and told me to stop being such a control freak. My daughter wouldn't even look up from her phone when I tried to talk to her about keeping things a bit more peaceful. It was like I was the enemy in my own home, and I couldn't find a way back in. Things got worse when my in-laws decided to bring over some of their things for convenience. I came home from a quick grocery run to find my father-in-law moving boxes into our spare room. When I confronted my wife, she just shrugged, saying it was only temporary and that it made things easier when they visited. It was clear that the boundaries I thought we'd set were slipping away faster than I could hold on to them. My work from home setup quickly fell apart. Calls with clients were constantly interrupted by noise from downstairs, and I started missing deadlines. It felt like every time I tried to focus, there was another door slamming or someone asking where something was in the kitchen. My boss even mentioned that I seemed distracted lately. It was like I was right back where I started, except now I had agreed to it. I tried talking to my wife again, reminding her of the promises we'd made before she moved back in. She just kept saying that the important thing was that the kids were happy and that her family felt welcome. But one evening, after her sister stayed late again, I lost my patience. We had a blow-up argument in the kitchen, voices raised loud enough that the kids probably heard from their rooms. I told her that nothing had changed, that I was just as trapped as before, but she fired back that I was the one who couldn't adapt. It ended with her walking away, saying she was done trying to make me happy. The kids took her side. My son, who used to look forward to our fishing trips, now barely spoke to me unless he was complaining that I was ruining everything again. My daughter wouldn't even sit in the same room if I brought up the idea of asking her aunt to call before coming over. It felt like I was losing them all over again. My suggestion to go back to counseling was shut down immediately. My wife said it was obvious that I couldn't change, that therapy wouldn't fix anything if I couldn't let go of my control issues. She made it clear she thought I was the problem, not her family. It was like every session we'd had before was completely forgotten. Things came to a head at another family barbecue. I wasn't planning on going, but my wife insisted it would look bad if I didn't. The whole time I could feel the tension in the air, especially whenever my mother-in-law was around. At one point, she started in again about how I'd caused so much stress for everyone, and I finally snapped. We ended up having a shouting match right there in front of everyone, and I walked out before I said something I'd regret. When I got home, my wife followed me, furious. She issued another ultimatum. Either I stopped making things difficult about her family being around, or she'd take the kids and leave again. She accused me of driving a wedge between her and her family, and that she couldn't take the stress anymore. That night, I posted another update online, laying everything out. I didn't know what to do anymore. The comments were as divided as ever. Some people told me to stand my ground, that I deserved to have my own space and peace. Others thought I was being unreasonable, that I should just let her family be part of our lives if it meant keeping everyone together. It left me wondering if maybe I was just fighting a battle I couldn't win. Update 4. I reached a breaking point. After that last argument and the way everything kept spiraling, I realized I needed to step back and clear my head. I moved out into a small apartment not far from our house. It was close enough to see the kids if they wanted, but far enough to get the space I desperately needed. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I was drowning in the chaos, and I couldn't keep going like that. When I told my wife, she was stunned. She couldn't believe I would actually leave over what she called petty rules. She accused me of abandoning the family, throwing away everything we'd built together over something that shouldn't matter so much. But I packed up my things and left anyway. There was no goodbye hug, no promises to work things out, just the sound of the door closing behind me. The kids didn't take it well either. They refused to visit me at first, saying I was being selfish and that I was the one who broke up the family. It was hard hearing that from them, knowing they were hurting and that my decision had made things even harder for them. I tried to explain that it wasn't forever, that I just needed some time to figure things out, but they didn't want to hear it. Meanwhile, my in-laws wasted no time stepping in. They practically moved into my old house, turning it into a hub for family gatherings. Whenever I drove by, I'd see extra cars in the driveway, hear the sounds of laughter and chatter spilling out from the open windows. It was like my absence had opened the door even wider for them. They turned my home into their space, and I was on the outside looking in. Living in the apartment was a strange adjustment. It was quiet, sometimes too quiet. I missed my kids, even the everyday noise of family life. But in the stillness, I found something I hadn't had in a long time: peace. I could focus on work again without constant interruptions. My productivity picked up, and I even managed to impress my boss with a new project. It was a small victory, but it reminded me that I was capable of standing on my own 2 feet. About 2 weeks after I moved out, my wife reached out. She started calling, asking if we could talk things through. She mentioned that maybe we could find a middle ground now that I had proven my point. She didn't say it directly, but it felt like she thought I'd come crawling back, ready to give up on the boundaries if it meant coming home. But I made my stance clear. I'd only come back if this time the boundaries were respected, no exceptions. I told her that I couldn't go back to how things were, with her family taking over our lives. She didn't give me an answer right away. Instead, she told me she'd have to discuss it with her family. That part stung, knowing that she still needed their input to make a decision that should have been just between us. It was like no matter what, her family's opinion would always weigh more than mine. But I waited, hoping that maybe she'd realize that we needed to make decisions as a couple. Eventually, my kids agreed to visit me at the apartment. I'd hoped for a chance to reconnect, but the entire time they kept talking about how much they missed home, their cousins, the family dinners. It felt like everything I did to make the apartment comfortable for them went unnoticed. My daughter kept asking when I was going to stop being difficult so that things could go back to how they used to be. I tried to keep the visit positive, but it left me feeling like I was just a visitor in their lives now. I talked to a few friends about the situation. Most of them said the same thing, that maybe it was time to move on if my wife couldn't put me and our relationship first. They told me I deserved better, that it wasn't right for her family to have so much control over our lives. But it wasn't that simple. I missed my family. I wanted to find a way to make it work, even if it meant fighting an uphill battle. Then came the letter, a notice that my wife was considering legal separation. Seeing that paper in my mailbox sent my heart racing. It made everything feel more real, like I was on the edge of losing everything for good. I didn't know if it was just a threat, a way to push me back into the fold, or if she was serious about ending things. Either way, it was a wake-up call that I might be facing a fight I wasn't ready for. My wife's behavior didn't make things any clearer. One day, she'd call and talk about how maybe we could work things out, that we could find a way to make everyone happy. The next, she'd be cold, barely responding to my messages. It was like she couldn't decide what she wanted either, and I was stuck in limbo, not knowing which way things were going to go. I posted another update on Reddit, laying it all out there. The responses were all over the place. Some people telling me to keep standing my ground, others saying I was risking my marriage over something that wasn't worth it. But a lot of commenters urged me to hold firm, reminding me that I had the right to have my boundaries respected, that I shouldn't let myself get walked over just to keep the peace. Finally, my wife agreed to meet with a mediator. It felt like a small glimmer of hope. Maybe with someone neutral guiding the conversation, we could finally break through the mess and find a way forward. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm hoping that this time, things might actually change. Update 5. The mediation session started off calm enough. We sat across from each other in a quiet office, a mediator between us, trying to guide the conversation. But it didn't take long for things to go off track. My wife defended her family, saying that they only wanted to help, that their intentions had always been good. I pushed back, pointing out how their constant presence in our lives had gone way beyond help. It had taken over our home and our peace. We went back and forth like that, the same arguments we'd had so many times before. The mediator listened patiently before suggesting a cooling off period. The idea was simple: we'd limit contact with her family for a while and focus on building our relationship back up. It made sense to me. It was a chance to reset without the constant pressure of her family's presence. My wife nodded during the session, but I could see she wasn't fully on board. Later, outside the mediator's office, she told me that she didn't think she could go through with it. She said it wasn't realistic, that her family would never understand. It felt like we were right back at square one, and I couldn't help but wonder what the point of the mediation had been. A few days later, my kids came to visit me at the apartment. They were quieter than usual, their smiles forced. We sat together, and out of nowhere, they broke down. My son, his voice trembling, asked me to come back home. My daughter added that they'd try to make things work, that they'd keep it quieter if I just stopped fighting with their mom. It hit me hard, seeing how desperate they were to have their family back together. But even then, I knew that going back without real change would only trap us in the same cycle. That night, after they left, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the walls that still felt like someone else's space. I realized that even with the mediation and the talks, nothing had truly changed. My wife couldn't break away from her family's influence, and I couldn't keep pretending that I could live like that. So I made a decision. I renewed my lease on the apartment, signaling that I was prepared to make this separation more permanent if it came to that. My wife must have sensed the shift because a few days later, she showed up at my door unannounced, tears in her eyes. She pleaded with me to give us another chance, to come back home. But I stood firm, telling her that I couldn't do it unless the boundaries we'd discussed were finally respected. She looked at me like she didn't understand why I couldn't just let it all go. But this time, I didn't back down. Things didn't get any easier after that. The next time my kids came over, the visit took a bad turn. They accused me of being too stubborn, of making everything harder on purpose. My son told me I was the reason they weren't all together, that I was ruining their lives. I tried to keep it together, but hearing those words from my own kids broke something inside me. I started seeing a therapist on my own. I didn't have any other choice. I was exhausted, barely sleeping, and the guilt was eating me up from the inside. I needed someone to help me make sense of everything, to find a way through the mess. It didn't fix things, but it gave me a space to talk without judgment, and that was something. Then, something unexpected happened. I got a job offer from a company in another state. It was a step up from what I was doing, with better pay and a chance for a fresh start. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. The idea of leaving completely felt like giving up on my family, but the thought of starting over somewhere new was tempting. I kept it to myself, trying to figure out if it was something I could really go through with. But secrets have a way of coming out. My wife found out about the job offer before I had a chance to bring it up. She showed up at my apartment again, this time angry, accusing me of planning to abandon the family completely. She called me a coward, said I was running away instead of facing our problems. The words stung, but I tried to stay calm. I told her that I wasn't abandoning anyone, but that I couldn't keep living a life where my needs didn't matter. That conversation turned into our final confrontation. She kept demanding to know why I couldn't just come back home, why I was willing to throw everything away over a few rules. I told her that it wasn't about the rules, that it was about having a life where I felt respected, where our home wasn't overrun by uninvited guests. I told her that I couldn't do it anymore, not like this. In the end, I made my decision. I accepted the job offer. I knew it meant leaving behind everything I'd tried to hold on to, but I couldn't keep living in the same cycle of conflict and disappointment. I needed a fresh start, even if it meant starting over alone. I made one final post on Reddit, sharing my decision with everyone who had followed the story from the beginning. I thanked the commenters for their support, for reminding me that my needs mattered too, even when it felt like I was fighting an uphill battle. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to find out. Now, with the moving boxes packed and my apartment lease ending soon, I'm preparing to start a new chapter. It's not the ending I expected, but it's the one I've chosen. For the first time in a long time, it feels like it's truly my choice. I, 27M, moved out 5 years ago, got a stable job, and live on my own. My younger brother, 24M, still lives at home with my mom, 50s, and let's just say he's got it easy. Mom has always been a bit controlling, but she loves having me visit. It used to be a normal routine. I'd drop by once a month, sometimes more, always bringing groceries, helping fix things around the house, and generally making sure everything was running smoothly. My brother, on the other hand, has never had to contribute. He works part-time, but mom covers most of his expenses: food, phone bill, even gas money. When our dad passed a few years ago, the dynamic shifted. Mom became more protective of him, like he needed to be shielded from reality. I assumed she'd eventually push him to be more independent, but instead, it's like she doubled down on treating him like a kid. A few weeks ago, I stopped by for a visit like I always do. I had a bag of groceries in one hand and a toolkit in the other, since Mom had mentioned her sink was leaking. As soon as I walked in, she seemed off. Usually she's excited to see me, but this time there was this weird tension. She sat me down and completely casually told me that moving forward, I'd need to start contributing financially whenever I visited. I laughed because I thought she was joking. I already bring groceries, fix things, and never stay overnight. I'm literally just there to visit. But she wasn't joking. She said that since my brother lives there full-time, guests, aka me, need to help cover the costs. I asked why this was suddenly a thing, and her answer made no sense. She said utilities and food expenses go up when people visit. I pointed at the groceries I had just bought and reminded her that I've never come empty-handed. But she doubled down, saying it was about fairness. This new rule only applied when my brother was home. If I visited while he was out, no rent fee. I asked why that mattered, and she got vague. The more I pushed, the clearer it became. This wasn't about fairness. This was about her wanting me to help cover my brother's expenses without actually making him contribute. My brother sat there through all of this, completely silent. Not defending her, not agreeing with me, just sitting there, avoiding eye contact. I told her this was ridiculous. I don't even stay the night. I come over, I help out, I bring food. Why should I have to pay to visit my own mother? She hit me with the classic, if you really cared about family, you wouldn't have an issue helping out. At that point, I was done. I told her I wasn't paying rent to visit my own childhood home and left earlier than planned. I figured she'd cool down and drop it, but a few days later she sent me a text reminding me of the new rule for next time. Now I don't know what to do. I love my mom, but this feels like she's trying to squeeze money out of me just so my brother can keep coasting. If I refuse, I know she'll play the guilt card even harder. So AITA for refusing to pay rent to visit my mom. A few days after I walked out of my mom's house, my phone buzzed. It was a text from her. Short and to the point, just a reminder that the new rent rule was in place for any future visits. No small talk, no hope you're doing well, just a straight-up demand. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Then I replied, asking why this rule only applied when my brother was home. If the issue was truly about me using utilities and eating food, then wouldn't it make sense for her to charge me every time? Her response came almost instantly. She explained that when my brother was home, expenses were naturally higher. More food being eaten, more water being used, more electricity. It was only fair that I pitched in since I had a good job and wasn't struggling. I asked if my brother was contributing at all. After a long pause, she admitted he had started paying for some small things, his own gas, a portion of the phone bill, but she quickly deflected, saying he wasn't in a position to take on real financial responsibility yet. At this point, I was done playing games. I sent back one final message. I'm not paying to visit. If that's your rule, I just won't come over anymore. Silence. For a while at least. Then another text came through. This one was longer, guilt-heavy. She talked about how real family helps each other, how my brother was struggling, how I had a good job and didn't understand what it was like to be in a tough spot. I ignored it. Later that night, my brother texted me out of nowhere. A casual message. Something about whether I was planning to visit soon. No mention of the rent rule. I replied with a question of my own. Did he think it was fair? His response took a while. Eventually, he sent back something vague about how mom just gets like this sometimes, and that it was best to just go along with it. I wasn't surprised. He'd always been good at keeping his head down, avoiding conflict. Then, out of nowhere I got a call from one of my aunts. She told me mom had been complaining to family, saying I was being stingy and refusing to help out. My aunt suggested I just pay a little to keep the peace. I asked her straight up, was mom actually struggling for money? Or was this just about my brother? My aunt hesitated before admitting that mom had been asking other family members for money recently. That was new information. I started thinking about my dad's money. He'd worked hard his whole life, and I knew he'd left something behind, but I had no idea what happened to it. The next weekend, I decided to test something. I showed up at my mom's house unannounced on a day I knew my brother wouldn't be home. The second she opened the door, her whole vibe was different. No cold shoulder, no mention of rent. She even looked happy to see me. I stepped inside, casually waited, but nothing. No mention of me needing to contribute. I let a little time pass before bringing up my brother. The moment I did, she slipped. She said, if he were here, I'd need you to chip in. That was it. That was all I needed to hear. This wasn't about bills. This wasn't about fairness. She was just trying to make me pay for my brother's expenses. I decided to push a little further. I asked her outright, what happened to dad's money? She didn't answer. Instead, she got defensive, saying it wasn't my concern. That was a red flag. Before I left, I had a private talk with my brother. I asked him if he knew anything about the money situation. He acted clueless, but something about the way he avoided eye contact told me he wasn't shocked by the question. I told my mom one last time that I already contributed. Groceries, repairs, all of it. I wasn't paying an entrance fee to see my own family. Her response, then don't come over. So I didn't. Now I'm just waiting to see how long it takes before she reaches out. I stuck to my word. I didn't reach out. Weeks passed, no calls, no texts, nothing. At first, it felt strange. I had always been the one to check in, to visit, to keep things running. But this time, I let the silence sit, and mom, she didn't reach out either. Instead, she took another route. One day, my cousin sent me a screenshot from Facebook. Mom had posted something about how some children forget who raised them, and how family is supposed to help each other, not turn their backs when times get tough. No names, but it wasn't subtle. The comments were full of distant relatives offering sympathy, telling her to stay strong and that real family would never abandon you. I ignored it. A few days later, my brother texted me. Casual, just asking if I was going to visit soon. No mention of the rent rule, no mention of the Facebook posts, just acting like nothing had happened. I didn't play along. I asked him directly, did he actually think it was fair that I had to pay to visit? He took his time replying, then sent back something vague about how mom just has her ways, and it's easier not to argue with her. I left him on read. Not long after, my phone rang. It was my aunt. She wasted no time. Mom had been complaining to the family that I was being stingy and refusing to help her when she needed it most. I asked her the same thing I had asked my brother. Did she think it was fair that I had to pay to visit my own mother? She hesitated. Then, a little softer, she admitted that Mom had been struggling financially. That was the first real piece of information I had gotten. Up until now, I had assumed this was all about my brother, about her trying to make sure he never had to contribute. But if she was struggling, really struggling, then this was bigger than just favoritism. I asked my aunt what she meant. She told me Mom had borrowed money from a few family members over the last year. Small amounts at first, but recently the numbers had gotten bigger. That didn't make sense. Dad had left money behind. It wasn't millions, but it was enough that Mom should have been okay for a long time. I needed answers. That weekend, I decided to go back to the house one last time. Not to visit, not to fall back into old habits, but to get to the truth. When I got there, she wasn't happy to see me. She was stiff, guarded. No warm welcome, no fake smile. Just straight to the point. Was I finally ready to do the right thing and help? I told her I wanted to know what happened to Dad's money. The shift was instant. Her face tightened. Her voice went sharp. She said it wasn't my business. I didn't let it go. I told her I knew she had been borrowing money. I knew she was behind on bills, and I wanted to know why. Because Dad had set her up to be fine. She deflected, changed the subject, got angry, called me disrespectful, told me I had no right to question her finances. That's when my brother walked in. I turned to him and asked, flat out, if he knew what was going on. He looked uncomfortable, but he didn't deny it. After a long pause, he admitted that Mom had been covering some of his bills with what was left of Dad's money. His car insurance, his phone bill, even some of his rent from when he tried moving out briefly, but came back home after a few months. Mom cut him off before he could say more. She started yelling about how he wasn't to blame, how she did everything for us, how I was the one turning my back on family. I finally saw the full picture. This wasn't just about making me pay to visit. Mom was in serious financial trouble, and instead of admitting it, she had been trying to squeeze money out of me under the guise of helping the family. I had a choice to make. She was expecting me to cave, to offer her money like the rest of the family had. But after everything, I wasn't sure if helping would actually help or just enable her to keep making bad decisions. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if my mother was someone I could trust. After that last visit, I started thinking, if Mom was really struggling financially, the best way to help wouldn't be to just hand her money. It would be to help her figure out how to manage what she had left. Throwing cash at the problem wouldn't fix anything if she was still making bad decisions. So I spent a few hours looking into options, budgeting apps, financial advisors, even a nonprofit in our area that helps people set up long-term financial plans. There were ways for her to get back on track, but she needed to actually want to fix the problem. A few days later, I called her. Straight to the point, I told her I wanted to help, but the best way to do that was to sit down together and go over her finances. I even mentioned the nonprofit and the budgeting tools I found. That did not go over well. She exploded, said she didn't need a lecture from her own son, that she needed support, not someone telling her what to do with her money. I barely got a word in before she went full guilt trip mode. She started bringing up everything she had done for us growing up, how she had sacrificed so much and now, when she needed us, we were abandoning her. Then she switched tactics. If my dad were still alive, he never would have let her struggle like this. He never would have allowed me to turn my back on her. I reminded her that Dad had planned for this. He worked hard, saved money, and left enough behind so she wouldn't be in this situation. I asked her directly, where did it all go? Silence. Then she hung up. That was my answer. Later that night, my brother texted me. It was another casual message, avoiding the main issue. I asked him straight up, did he know how bad things really were? His reply came after a long pause. I don't know, she doesn't tell me much, but she keeps asking me to cover little things here and there. I pushed for details. Turns out, he had covered the electric bill last month because it was overdue. That was the first time she had ever asked him for money. That told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just low on money. She was running out. Not long after, my aunt called me again. She sounded tired, said Mom had been borrowing from multiple family members, and some of them were starting to get fed up. One of my cousins even reached out, completely out of the blue, asking why I was refusing to help my own mother. Mom had been working the family group chat, spinning her version of the story. In her version, I was the cold-hearted son who had abandoned his struggling mother while living comfortably on my own. I told my cousin the truth, that I had been helping all these years, that I always brought groceries, fixed things around the house, and checked in. That Mom wasn't just struggling, she had burned through what Dad left behind, and instead of admitting it, she was trying to guilt me into bailing her out. The cousin didn't know what to say. I could tell they were starting to see through it. Then, the final blow. Mom sent me a long text, one of those dramatic guilt-ridden messages designed to pull at every emotional string. She talked about how she had given up everything for us, how she had always put family first, and now that she needed help, she was being left to suffer. I read it twice before responding. I told her again, I was willing to help, but not by just handing over money. If she was ready to sit down and actually figure out a plan, I'd be there. Her response, "If you can't contribute financially, then don't bother coming around anymore." I stared at my phone for a long time after that. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about control, manipulation, and the fact that, deep down, she knew what she was doing. I didn't reply. I had no idea what was coming next. But I knew one thing. Mom wasn't done yet. It had been a week since Mom sent her ultimatum. I didn't reach out, and she didn't either. The silence should have been a relief, but it just felt like the calm before the storm. Then, late one night, my phone buzzed. It was my brother. At first, I thought it was another casual message, him checking in without mentioning the real problem. But this time, he got straight to the point. He needed money, not a loan, not something small to hold him over until payday. He needed real help. I asked what was going on. For the first time, he admitted things were worse than he let on. Mom had been covering almost all of his expenses for years, and now that she was in financial trouble, she had started leaning on him instead. He was scrambling. She had asked him to cover more bills than usual. His phone, the internet, even part of the mortgage payment. He didn't have enough to keep up. I asked how bad it really was. He hesitated before telling me that he thought Mom had credit card debt. He didn't know how much, but from the way she was acting, he was guessing it was a lot. I asked if he thought she had completely run out of money. His answer was short, "It's bad." That confirmed it. I told him straight up, I wasn't going to just hand him cash. If he was struggling because Mom had been paying for everything his whole life, then the solution wasn't me stepping in to replace her. He needed to figure out how to be independent. He didn't argue. Instead, he admitted that he felt guilty, that he knew Mom had enabled him by never making him contribute. He had gotten used to it, but now that the money was running out, he realized he had no backup plan. Then he told me something I didn't expect. Mom had been lashing out, not just at me, but at him too. She was constantly stressed, snapping at him over little things. One minute she was saying he needed to step up and help more, and the next she was acting like he was the only thing keeping her going. He didn't know what to do. I asked if she had tried asking anyone else for money. She had. She went to another family member recently, asking for help with just a small loan. They turned her down. Word was spreading. The family was starting to talk. People were questioning what she was actually doing with her money. I asked him what he was going to do. He didn't have an answer. He didn't want to lose Mom's support. But he also knew she wasn't handling things well. I told him the truth. He needed to start taking control of his own finances. He hesitated, mumbling that maybe he could start paying her a little each month. But when I pointed out that she would keep asking for more, he finally admitted, "I know you're right, but it's not that easy." It took him a few more weeks of seeing Mom's financial mess unravel before he accepted that moving out was his only option. I asked him if he even wanted to keep living with her. He paused for a long time before saying, "I don't know." Then he dropped something huge. He told me Mom had talked about selling the house. Not in a serious way, more like a passing comment. But it stuck with him. I asked if he thought she meant it. He didn't know. That changed everything. If she was considering selling the house, then things had to be worse than I thought. The house was her last real asset. If she lost that, she'd have nothing. Now I had a new problem. Mom wasn't going to change. That much was clear. But my brother, he was finally seeing the reality of the situation. I needed to figure out what to do next before things got even messier. I should have known Mom wasn't done. After my brother told me she was considering selling the house, I expected her to reach out, maybe try another guilt trip. But instead of calling me directly, she took things to the family group chat. One morning, I woke up to a long dramatic message from her. She was telling everyone about how she had always sacrificed for her kids, but now she was struggling to keep a roof over her head while one of her children, me, was living comfortably and refusing to help. She made it sound like I had abandoned her, like she was days away from being homeless while I was hoarding money. She even threw in that my dad would be ashamed if he knew how selfish I had become. It was all designed to make me look like the villain. The reactions were mixed. Some relatives jumped to defend her, saying family should always help family. Others just reacted with generic supportive messages, probably to avoid drama. But then, a few people reached out to me privately. Some of my aunts and cousins had already heard bits and pieces about what was going on. A couple of them told me they knew something wasn't right. They had lent her money recently, and she had never paid them back. One even admitted that when they offered to help with budgeting instead of giving her cash, she got angry and cut contact. That's when I realized Mom had been trying this same routine on multiple people. I wasn't the only one who had caught on. Then came the next level of craziness. A cousin texted me later that day with something unbelievable. Mom had started subtly suggesting that family members help out when they visited. First it was, "Oh, could you chip in for groceries? Then I've been struggling with bills. Any little bit helps." But when she outright told an uncle he should contribute just for sitting in her living room, people started pulling away. Yes, really. Apparently she told one of our uncles that if he was going to sit in her living room and drink her coffee, he should contribute to the bills. He laughed it off at first, but when she kept pushing, he just left. Someone else in the family called her out publicly in the group chat, asking why she suddenly needed so much money when she had been fine before. Mom ignored the question completely. While all of this was happening, my brother was getting worse. He called me one night completely exhausted, said he couldn't take it anymore. The constant guilt trips, the passive-aggressive comments, the pressure of being expected to suddenly handle things after years of being treated like a child. For the first time, he was seriously considering moving out. I didn't push, I just told him what he already knew. If he stayed, this wouldn't end. She would keep leaning on him until there was nothing left. Then, I got more confirmation of just how bad things really were. One of my aunts called me privately. She told me she had heard that mom wasn't just struggling. She was deep in debt. She had no savings left. Whatever my dad had left behind, gone. I asked my brother if he knew about any of this. He hesitated. I mean, I noticed she's been stressed about money, but I didn't think it was this bad. He told me there had been unopened bills stacked on the kitchen counter for weeks, but mom had brushed it off whenever he asked. But after hearing it, it was like something clicked for him. He finally saw what I had been trying to tell him. Mom wasn't just asking for help. She was dragging people down with her. Then came her final move. She called me crying. It started out soft, almost like she was trying to mend things, but within minutes it turned into full-blown emotional blackmail. She repeated everything from her group chat rant, about how she had sacrificed everything, how she had always put family first, how I was choosing money over my own mother. Then, of course, she brought up Dad. If he were still alive, he would never have let me treat her this way. He would have made sure she was taken care of. He would have been disgusted with me. I let her talk. Then, when she finally stopped, I gave her the same answer I had before. I would only help if she was willing to change. If she wanted to fix her finances, make a plan, figure out a real way forward, I'd be there. She hung up on me. And that was it. A few days later, my brother texted me. He had made a decision. He wanted out. He asked if I could help him find a place of his own. At the same time, mom went completely silent. No texts, no calls, not even any cryptic Facebook posts. I don't know if she's finally realizing that her behavior is pushing us away, or if she's just gearing up for something even worse. My brother was finally serious about moving out. After our last talk, he started looking for apartments. He found a small place with a friend who was also searching for a roommate. Nothing fancy, but affordable and far enough from mom that she wouldn't be dropping by unannounced. But he was scared to tell her. He knew exactly how she would react. So his plan was simple: sign the lease first, then break the news. That way, there was no way for her to talk him out of it. Then, completely out of nowhere, mom bought him a brand new gaming console. When I asked how she afforded it, she brushed it off, saying she had figured something out. Later, I learned she had used a payday loan, borrowing at ridiculous interest rates just to keep up the illusion that nothing was wrong. She had spent weeks complaining about struggling financially, borrowing from family, and guilt-tripping both of us for not giving her money. And now suddenly she was making expensive purchases. I asked him where the money came from. He wasn't sure. Maybe she had sold something. Maybe it was a tax refund. Maybe she had hidden money this whole time. Then, a family member filled in the blanks. Mom had taken out a payday loan, the high-interest kind. The kind that traps people in an endless cycle of debt. That's when it became clear she wasn't just struggling. She was desperate. And the worst part, she was using that borrowed money to keep him at home. She started bribing him with gifts, acting extra affectionate, bringing up childhood memories, and constantly saying how much she needed him there. Then she pulled the classic move: health problems. She started dropping comments about how she'd been having chest pains, about how the stress of everything was making her sick. My brother was shaken enough that he took her to the doctor. Turns out, she was fine. Stressed? Yes, but nothing physically wrong. The doctor even told her to focus on managing her stress levels. The moment she got home, she flipped the story. She told everyone she was having serious heart issues and that we were the reason. By this point, family members were losing patience. The constant money requests, the guilt tripping, the dramatic Facebook posts, it was all wearing thin. One of our aunts, who had been one of her biggest supporters, finally snapped and told her to figure it out like an adult. So, mom switched strategies. She told my brother that if he really wanted to help, he should start paying her rent. But here's the kicker. She didn't actually need the money to cover the mortgage. She told him he'd only have to pay a small amount, just enough to say he was contributing. It was a manipulation tactic. If he started paying her even a little, it would be that much harder to leave. She could use it against him later. I confronted her about the payday loan. She denied it completely, even though we had proof. Even though multiple family members knew about it. She stuck to her story. There was no loan, and I was just trying to make her look bad. That's when I realized just how deep in denial she was. Then she dropped her next bombshell. She was considering taking out a second mortgage on the house. She said it like it was the perfect solution, like it would magically fix everything. But she was already behind on bills. Adding more debt, that was just digging a deeper hole. My brother didn't wait any longer. He signed the lease. Now the only thing left was telling mom. And when he did, all hell was going to break loose. My brother had officially signed the lease. He had 2 weeks before moving in, and his plan was to keep things quiet until the last minute. He figured telling mom the day before would minimize the fallout. Less time for her to guilt trip, less time for her to pull anything crazy. That plan didn't last. Mom found out by accident. She was using his laptop for something and saw an email notification pop up. A rental application approval. She clicked on it, read through everything, and lost it. The explosion was immediate, screaming, crying, demanding to know why he was betraying her. Then came the emotional manipulation. She told him that if he left, she'd never forgive him, that he was abandoning her, that she had given him everything, and now he was just walking away and leaving her to suffer alone. Then she took it up a notch. If you want to leave so badly, then get out now. She stormed into his room, grabbed a garbage bag, and started shoving his clothes into it, throwing things into piles, tossing stuff into the hallway, telling him that if he was so eager to go, she wasn't going to wait 2 weeks. He could leave today. That's when he called me. I could hear the panic in his voice. He didn't know what to do. He was trying to stop her, but she wasn't listening. I told him to start packing properly. Don't let her throw his stuff around. Just get it together. I was on my way. When I got there, the front door was already open. His things were scattered all over, some in bags, some in a messy pile near the door. Mom was standing there, arms crossed, looking furious. The second she saw me, her tone changed. Suddenly, I was the villain. I was the one stealing her son away. I was the reason this was happening. She blocked the door. You're not taking him. This is his home. I told her the truth. She had pushed him to this. This wasn't about me. This was about how she had treated both of us. About how she had manipulated him for years, and about how he finally saw it. She didn't want to hear it. Then something I never expected. My brother tried to reason with her. Mom, I'm not leaving you behind. I just need to stand on my own. She cut him off, screaming about how he was betraying her. He looked at me, hesitation clear on his face. For a moment, I thought he would cave. But then, in a quieter voice, he said, I love you, but I can't live like this anymore. That was it. That was the moment. She broke down. Full meltdown. Tears, shaking, gasping like she couldn't breathe, saying over and over that she was going to be homeless, that she had no one left, that we were choosing money over family. We ignored it. We finished packing, loaded everything into my car, and we left. A few hours later, she blocked both of us on everything. No calls, no messages, just silence. For a while. Then family members started reaching out with stories of how she had gone to them, spinning a tale of betrayal. A cousin forwarded me a message. I raised my sons alone and now I'm being abandoned in my time of need. If only their father could see them now. She wasn't done. She was just shifting strategies. For the first time in a long time, my brother was free, but something told me this wasn't over yet. The silence was eerie. For someone who had spent months guilt-tripping, demanding money and playing the victim, Mom going completely silent felt off. She had blocked both me and my brother after he moved out. No cryptic Facebook posts, no desperate calls, just nothing. It was unsettling. But the rest of the family wasn't quiet. Some relatives were furious at her, saying she had pushed us both away with her behavior. Others, still unaware of the full picture, said, family is family, she's still your mother. But as more details surfaced, like the payday loan and her attempts to charge relatives, some of her biggest defenders started going quiet. I ignored it. Then, one of my aunts, the one who had been closest to my dad, called me. She had finally decided to spill everything. And it was worse than I thought. Dad had left a lot more money than I ever knew. It should have been enough to keep Mom stable for at least a decade if managed properly. But over the years she had spent recklessly, first on renovations she never finished, then on risky investments, and finally on keeping my brother financially dependent. Instead of budgeting, she had drained the savings account to maintain the illusion of stability. The house was fully paid off. He had left her a solid savings account, plus an investment portfolio that, if managed properly, would have kept her comfortable indefinitely. So where did it all go? Lavish spending, bad investments, and worst of all, bailing out my brother for years. Every time he wanted something, she gave it to him. New car? She covered it. Expensive electronics? No problem. Rent when he moved out for a few months and couldn't afford it. She paid that too. But that wasn't the biggest shock. My aunt had heard rumors that Mom still had money stashed away, a secret account she wasn't touching, because once it was gone, that was it. She wasn't broke. She was just desperate to keep the lifestyle she had before the money ran out. I checked public records for the house. She was months behind on her mortgage. She had refinanced it at some point, despite my dad leaving it paid off, and now, she was in danger of losing it. At this point, I knew I couldn't fix her, but I still sent one last message. I told her that I'd help, but only if she was willing to make a real financial plan. No more emotional manipulation, no more avoiding reality, just a structured way forward. Her response? You abandoned your family. I don't need your help. That was it. My brother, despite everything, felt relieved. He was finally out. He had started learning how to budget, cook for himself, and plan for his future, things that Mom had never taught him because she had always taken care of everything for him. The extended family picked sides. Some completely cut contact with Mom after realizing what she had done. Others blamed me for turning my back on her. Then came her final move. She sold Dad's car, one of the last things he had left behind. That was when I knew. She wasn't just out of money, she was out of control. She wasn't willing to change, and she never would be. I went fully no contact, and for the first time in years, I felt free.